The man who found it that morning had been putting his boots on rocky ground before most people woke up for 30-odd years. He had worked timber sales in the Cherokee National Forest since before the turn of the century. He knew how a black bear moved through rhododendron in low light, knew the difference between the sound of a tree settling against cold and the sound of something with intention moving through the understory, had read the backcountry of Unicoi County, Tennessee, the way some people read a familiar book, each time recovering details they had missed before. None of it prepared him for what he found at the head of the drainage on that Wednesday morning in October of 2017. He came through the last wall of rhododendron onto a gravel bar at the head of an unnamed tributary of Rock Creek, and something was lying in the mud at the edge of the water that his eyes spent 15 or 20 seconds refusing to classify. Large. Alive. The chest was moving slow, wet, labored, and the head was wrong in a way that could not be explained away. The skull was too wide at the back, and the muzzle extended too far forward, the ears still tracking sound even though nothing else about the body could move anymore. He ran through everything he knew about what lives in those mountains. He came to the same answer each time. What was lying on that gravel bar was a DOGMAN, and it was dying, and it was looking at him with one pale copper-gold eye that had not stopped tracking since he stepped out of the rhododendron. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. He agreed to talk on one condition, that we not use his real name. We are going to call him Les. He has spent the better part of 3 decades working timber in the Cherokee National Forest and the surrounding district, and the professional relationships that sustain that career depend on a credibility that does not rebuild easily once it is gone. His real name stays out of this. Everything else in this account is as close to accurate as this kind of work allows. Les grew up in Limestone Cove, a small community at the base of Unaka Mountain in Unicoi County. The Limestone Cove area sits in a narrow valley between Unaka Mountain to the north and the smaller ridges of the Bald Mountains to the south, where State Route 197 winds between the slopes toward Irwin. It is the kind of place that exists because the mountains created a specific kind of livelihood, and the families who stayed in it across generations tended to be families whose identities were built on knowing that livelihood from the inside. Les's grandfather worked early Forest Service salvage sales in the 1930s, back when the government was buying the exhausted private timberland. The big lumber operations had stripped in the early part of the century, and trying to grow a national forest back on eroded ridges that had been cut over, burned off, and left to whatever could take hold. His grandfather knew the specific draws and hollows and creek systems of those mountains before the Forest Service mapped them, and the Forest Service came to rely on people like him for the local knowledge that professional foresters from outside the county could not have acquired in a decade of patrols. His father ran a small sawmill outside of Limestone Cove until the mid-90s, when the economics of small mill hardwood sawing stopped supporting the overhead. Les went into the woods himself in his early 20s, took a faller's certificate course, and never found a compelling reason to do anything else. By his late 30s, he had built a reputation in the Watauga Ranger District as one of the more reliable independent fallers in the Cherokee, someone who showed up on bad mornings, who could lay out a safe felling pattern in timber other crews would walk away from, and who had enough years of reading the mountain to know when the ground was telling him something worth hearing. He is a deacon at a Baptist church in Irwin, the Unicoi County seat. He mentions this, not to claim anything about his faith, but to describe what kind of man he is. Not one given to exaggeration, not one who reaches for dramatic explanations when ordinary ones are available. He arrived at conclusions through evidence. What the evidence showed him on October 15th of 2017 has not changed, no matter how many times he has looked at it since. His crew on that fall sale was small. Himself and a man he had worked with regularly over the years, whom we will call Miles. Miles was from Johnson City, about 20 miles to the north, practical and capable in the way of people whose entire working life has been spent around heavy machinery and the specific demands of mountain terrain. He drove up each morning rather than staying near the site. He knew timber, and he knew his equipment, and he was not the kind of man who said much that he didn't need to say. Les trusted him completely. Unaka Mountain itself rises to 5,180 feet above sea level, making it one of the higher peaks in the Unicoi Range, the section of the Blue Ridge system that forms the Tennessee-North Carolina state line east of the Great Smoky Mountains. The Watauga Ranger District of the Cherokee National Forest, administered from the office in Elizabethton, manages the national forest land in this section of the range, and the district includes the Unaka Mountain Wilderness, a federally designated wilderness area of nearly 5,000 acres, centered on the upper slopes and summit of the mountain. Below the wilderness boundary, timber sales and other management activities are permitted within the framework of the forest plan. The sale they were working occupied parcels on the south slopes of Unaka Mountain at elevations between roughly 3,400 and 4,200 feet in the managed forest below the wilderness boundary. The south face falls away from the summit in a series of benches divided by steep drainages that channel runoff off the mountain toward Rock Creek at the base of the south slope.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Forest Road 230, the Unaka Mountain Road climbs the southwest face from Irwin, and the sale parcels were accessed off an unmarked spur that branches from the main forest road about 5 miles in from the highway. The timber in those benches was old second growth, 80 to 100 years of uncut growth, yellow poplar and red oak making up most of the volume. Some of those trees ran 40 inches at the stump, the kind of timber that grades high and comes out of the mill at the top end of the scale. The terrain above the upper bench added a layer of complexity to the sale that the lower parcels did not have. At roughly 4,400 to 4,500 feet, the slope steepened dramatically as it approached the limestone cliff band that runs along the southwest face of Unaka Mountain in that section. The cliff band is a natural geologic feature, exposed rock 40 to 50 feet high in places, the result of decades of freeze-thaw cycles working on the limestone-rich upper substrate and separating sections of the face, leaving them standing against the slope. Below the cliff base was a talus zone of broken rock, before the slope gentled enough for soil to accumulate and timber to grow. Above the cliff was the wilderness boundary. The sale parcels ran up to about 100 yards below the cliff base, with the upper boundary markers set in the terrain below the talus zone. They had been on the sale for 2 weeks by mid-October. The access road had needed work at the start plugged drainage culverts, a section of road that had slumped toward a draw on the downhill side, low growth across the right-of-way, and that cost 3 days before they could run loaded trucks on it. By the second week they were in full production, dropping yellow poplar and red oak in the upper benches, and yarding it to the landing where the log trucks came up every second day for loads to the mill in Irwin. Something was wrong in the upper timber by the 5th day. Les noticed it as an absence first, the absence of everything that should have been present. The forest above the landing was too quiet, not the natural quiet of a cold October morning before the light reaches the slope and the birds start working. Quieter than that, with the specific quality of a space that has been vacated rather than simply undisturbed. The squirrels that should have been working the oak mast in mid-October were not in the upper sale area. The ravens that typically follow any logging operation in those mountains, coming for whatever the slash piles and the equipment disturbance turn up, would come to the landing and stop there. They would not go into the upper timber. Lay stood at the landing more than once and watched them circle the edge of it and turn back. On the 9th day of the sale, a doe came out of the upper timber at a dead run before 6 in the morning, before the saws were running. Les had just started his truck. She came through the landing at full speed and did not slow down, crossing it and going into the lower timber at the same pace. She had not been running from noise. The engines were cold and the saws were cold and the mountain was quiet at that hour. She had been running from a direction. The direction was downhill and away from the upper parcels, from whatever was in the timber above the landing that she did not want to be near. Les mentioned it to Miles that evening. Miles said the deer were probably reacting to the general disruption of the sale, which was reasonable. Les agreed out loud. In his head, he filed the doe in a different category alongside the empty upper canopy and the ravens stopping short at the landing's edge. The days between the 5th and the 14th were the accumulation phase, the period in which the evidence built without announcing itself. On 2 separate occasions during that stretch, Les found elk beds, the oval depressions that a resting bull leaves in the undergrowth in the lower portions of the sale area, well below the upper bench where he was cutting. Elk in those mountains typically bed in the higher, denser timber during the day, moving to the lower ground in the evening to browse and water. Finding fresh beds in the lower sale area in the middle of the morning indicated animals that had come down from above during the night and not returned. He noted this, the same way he noted the ravens and the doe and the too quiet upper canopy. He filed it in the same category and kept working. By the 12th day, he had also found 2 sets of large canid tracks on the soft shoulder of the spur road, where it crossed a drainage below the landing. He took them at first for bear tracks. The rear feet of a walking bear can look superficially like oversized dog prints, but the gait pattern was wrong for a bear on all fours and wrong for a bear occasionally rearing up. Both sets showed a bipedal stride, the rear foot landing in a separate position from the front, rather than registering in the front print the way a bear's does, with the spacing between left and right feet wider than any canid he knew would produce. He measured the stride on the clearer of the 2 sets and got 42 inches, not as long as what he would find on the gravel bar 3 days later. But in the same category, he did not photograph these tracks. He looked at them, measured one, spent a few minutes on his knees reading the patterns, and then stood up and went back to work. He says this now with a kind of self-deprecation that is not quite regret. He had not yet accumulated enough pieces to understand what kind of picture they were building. By the time he came back to the sale area 3 days later with Miles and found the body gone and the tracks in the mud around the impression, he had enough pieces. And he understood. If you have spent any time in the Limestone Cove country or on the south face of Unaka Mountain, you know what that forest looks like in October. The rhododendron along the drainages goes dense and dark as the temperatures drop. The yellow poplar leaves come down in sheets after the first hard frost, and the canopy opens up in a way that makes the upper slopes look entirely different from what they were in August. The air above 4,000 feet in mid-October has a sharpness that the valley floor doesn't have in any season, a clarity that carries sound farther than you expect it to, and makes the silences between sounds seem longer than they are. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen in the Cherokee National Forest or anywhere in that stretch of Unicoi County, because the reports coming out of those upper drainages go back considerably further than 2017. On the morning of October 15th, Les arrived at the landing before 6. Miles had called the night before to say a family matter would put him on site by 8. Les had told him not to rush. The plan for the morning was to walk the upper bench above the current cutting area and lay out the felling pattern for the next phase of the harvest, marking trees, pacing felling lanes, noting fall clearances, doing the preparatory work that goes faster alone. He took his marking paint, a tape measure, a compass, and the Husqvarna 57.6 in the scabbard on his back in case he needed to clear saplings from a planned felling lane. He started up the skid trail at 6:15 with enough light above the ridge line to see his footing. The skid trail climbed northeast from the landing in a series of switchbacks through the lower timber, then straightened as it crossed the first bench, and continued toward the upper bench where the big yellow poplar stood. Beyond the upper bench, the terrain broke upward again toward the head of the drainage and the limestone cliff band on the upper slope. The drainage that ran through the bench, a small, unnamed tributary of Rock Creek, cut through a notch in the terrain at the bench's upper end and climbed steeply toward its headwaters, before vanishing into a dense rhododendron thicket where the creek reduced to a trickle between exposed root masses and mossy rock. Les had walked past the head of that drainage on both his previous boundary visits and had noted the rhododendron as unusually dense, even by Unaka Mountain standards. He spent 20 minutes walking the bench, marking trees, pacing the distances between the trees he intended to leave, and noting which felling directions gave clean clearances. He was near the head of the drainage, where the bench narrowed and the slope above angled upward toward the cliff base, when the sound of the creek changed. He uses the word quality, not the volume, not a specific identifiable change, but the quality. The drainage had been background noise since he came onto the bench, constant, ambient, the way running water becomes part of the silence of a place, rather than a disruption of it. Now it was different. Something was underneath it. Below the water sound and below the wind in the canopy above him was a rhythm that the creek was not making, wet and slow, with a pace that was nothing like the irregular percussion of water over rock. He stopped and held still and listened. He moved toward it. He angled through the rhododendron toward the sound, moving by feel through stems thick enough to stop light, placing each foot with the care of 30 years of moving through dense mountain cover, until the last wall of branches gave way and he stepped out onto the gravel bar at the head of the drainage. He stopped at the margin of the thicket, and he looked at what was in front of him. Large. That was the first word his mind produced, and it was inadequate, but it was the first thing. The torso was as long as a man's and heavier than a man's, thick through the chest and shoulders with a build that implied serious mass. 300 pounds at minimum, possibly more, deep enough that the larger stones of the bar surface had been pushed down into the mud beneath it, the surrounding sediment displaced and compressed at the body's edge. The arms were too long, extending well past where a bear's forelimbs would end, and resolving into hands at the terminus. Hands, 5-fingered, the clawed tips resting in the mud in a loose curl, the structure of palm and digits unmistakable in the improving drainage light. The legs were bent at the knee in the geometry of something designed for upright movement, the hip-to-ankle alignment of a biped, not a quadruped. The fur was dense and dark, brown going to black in the rhododendron shadow, matted across the upper torso and down one side with what his field experience read immediately as blood. A substantial amount of blood, spread into the surrounding mud and into the thin flow of the creek itself, dispersing downstream in a faint, dark wash. The head was what kept stopping his assessment. He had been cataloging the body, the limbs, the blood, doing the automatic inventory. His decades of fieldwork had trained him to perform, and the head kept interrupting the process by not resolving into anything familiar. The skull was too wide at the back, too long front to back. The muzzle extended forward in the specific profile of a large canine, the slope from brow to nose, the jawline, the orbital structure above the eyes, but at a scale that placed it outside every reference frame he had from 30 years in the southern Appalachians. The ears were pointed and set high on the skull. One of them, the upper one, the one not pressed against the mud, was moving, making small adjustments, tracking the sounds around it. His arrival had registered. The eye that faced upward was open, pale copper gold. The color of it, in the thin drainage light at 6:30 in the morning in October, was a shade he has returned to describing many times and cannot improve on. Not the warm amber he associates with a dog's eyes in firelight. Cooler than that, paler. The color of water moving over copper-colored clay, lit from underneath. The eye was open, and it was looking at him with the quality of attention that does not calculate harm. Not the assessment a predator makes of potential prey. Not the fear response of a large animal cornered. Not the flat, dilated look of shock. He has spent 30 years reading animal eyes in the field, and what he was reading from that eye on that gravel bar was something he reached for more than once without finding a better word than recognition. The eye knew what it was looking at. He sat down on a moss-covered log at the edge of the gravel bar, about 10 feet from the creature. And he stayed. He cannot fully account for the decision. He says some part of him understood that leaving at that moment would be a failure of something he did not have a name for, and that sitting was what the situation asked for. He is a man who responds to what a situation requires. He has been doing that in the backcountry for 30-odd years. The wounds became clearer as the light in the drainage improved over the next half hour. The sun was clearing the ridge by 6:45 and beginning to find the south face. And by 7, the drainage had enough light that he could read the damage in detail. Deep lacerations across the upper chest and left shoulder. Not the parallel scratches of a claw fight, but the tearing pattern you see from contact with something irregular and hard at significant force. The kind of damage a body absorbs when it impacts exposed rock rather than when something impacts it. The right arm, the one away from him on the mud side, was wrong at the forearm, bent at an angle that indicated fracture in a place a limb should not be able to bend without structural failure. The fur across the upper abdomen was soaked through in the denser, darker pattern of internal bleeding working toward the surface. He had seen enough field mortality in 30 years of backcountry work to understand the difference between an animal that was hours from death and one that was minutes from it. This was the second kind. He looked up the drainage. Above the rhododendron canopy and the upper reach of the creek where it steepened toward the wilderness boundary, the limestone cliff band was visible in the morning light, pale rock catching the early sun against the darker timber, 40 to 50 feet of exposed face above the talus zone, 180 yards, maybe 200, of steep terrain from the cliff base to the gravel bar. Slope, broken rock, drainage, rhododendron. A large animal coming off the top of that cliff face and hitting the talus below would arrive at the drainage in the condition and position Les was looking at. The injuries fit. The direction fit, whether it had fallen accidentally, been driven to the edge by a territorial conflict above the cliff, or come down deliberately under circumstances he could not reconstruct. The evidence in front of him did not answer. He sat on the log for a long time. During that time, the eye opened and found him on approximately 6 or 7 occasions, tracking his stillness and then closing again, then opening and finding him again in the same position. On none of those occasions did it show alarm or aggression. The tracking was the same kind of tracking a person does when they are monitoring a presence in the room, with them noting position, confirming continuity of that position, registering no threat. The breathing remained labored and wet throughout, slower in the second half of the encounter than the first, with the specific irregular cadence that signals the body is no longer managing its own respiration with full efficiency. Les sat through all of it, and did not speak, and did not move closer. And whatever was in the rhododendron thicket at his back, and something was, he is certain of that now, certain in a way he was not fully aware of during the encounter itself, made no further indication of itself. There were things he noticed during that hour that he has returned to describe in detail across multiple conversations, details that did not seem significant in the moment, and became more significant as the overall picture developed. At some point in the middle section of the encounter, the creek near the body slowed perceptibly. The flow was unchanged, but the area around the creature seemed to absorb sound differently than the open drainage above it. Les noticed this the way you notice a change in air pressure. As a physical thing, the body registers before the mind catches up with it. The birds that should have been calling in the canopy above the drainage were not calling. He had been aware of this from the moment he stepped onto the gravel bar. But during the middle section of the encounter, the silence expanded. Not just the absence of birdsong, but a broader, more complete quiet that seemed to extend from the rhododendron thicket at his back, outward and upward through the timber on either side of the drainage. He had worked in these mountains long enough to know that this kind of quiet does not occur naturally. It is produced. Something in the surrounding terrain was watching the drainage, and the watching was producing the silence. He also noticed, around the 40-minute mark, that the creature had been observing him with a regularity that was not random. The amber gold eye opened at intervals that were consistent roughly every 4 or 5 minutes, and when it opened, it found him immediately, without searching, not the slow scan of an injured animal tracking a moving target. A direct find, as if the creature knew exactly where he was sitting without needing to look. He does not know what to make of this. He reports it the way he reports everything else, as what he observed, without interpretation beyond what the observation supports. What it supports is the conclusion that the creature's awareness of his position was continuous, not periodic, and that the eye openings were checks rather than searches. He became aware of the change in the space behind him at some point in the middle of the encounter, maybe 25 minutes in. Not a sound he can identify, and not a smell, and not a movement in the peripheral. Something more like what happens when a room becomes occupied while your back is turned. A shift in the quality of the silence that the body processes before the conscious mind catches up with it. He did not turn around. He has examined this decision across many years of subsequent reflection and believes it was the correct one, though the reasoning is something he arrives at through feel rather than logic. He sat facing the creek, kept his attention on the creature in front of him, and let the rhododendron behind him be whatever it was. The creature made one sound during the hour Les was with it. Not a bark, not a howl, not any vocalization he would have associated with a large canine in distress. A tone, sustained for about 3 seconds, felt in his chest wall before his ears registered it as something in the range of hearing, low enough that the word sound sits at the edge of its accuracy, more like a transmission in a register that human hearing catches only at its outermost edge, the way you sense some frequencies through the body before the ears sort them. The quality of it, the organization of it, was unlike any animal distress call he had encountered. It had structure, a specific beginning, a sustained middle, a deliberate decay at the end. He does not claim to know what it meant. He describes it as the sound of something communicating rather than the sound of something reacting. He is careful about the distinction. This happened about 10 minutes before the end. What happened at the end is why Les agreed to talk. The creature turned its head. The effort required was visible and deliberate. He watched the neck muscles working against what gravity and injury and the failing of internal systems had fixed in place. The head had been oriented toward him since he sat down, the copper gold eye finding him periodically, tracking his position, closing, opening again, and finding him still there. Now the head turned away. Northwest, toward the upper reach of the drainage, toward the creek's headwaters above the rhododendron, toward the steep pitch below the limestone cliff band, and the wilderness that began above it. The head settled in that direction and held there, 15 or 20 seconds, while the breathing continued its slow, labored rhythm. Then the right arm moved, the arm that had been still in the mud the entire time, the one with the compound fracture in the forearm, the one Les had watched for any sign of function and found none. It lifted, a few inches off the mud, at the cost of visible effort. The shoulder and upper arm working against the failure below, against a limb the body could barely still command. The hand opened, not the precise single-finger extension of a human pointing at a specific thing. The whole hand, palm turning outward, fingers spreading and curving slightly, the clawed tips angling toward the northwest, toward the upper creek, toward the cliff and the wilderness above it. The entire arm from shoulder to fingertip held that orientation. 8 seconds. He counted without meaning to. Then the arm lowered into the mud. The breathing went through 2 more cycles after that and did not recover. The copper-gold eye, when he checked it next, was still. Les sat on the log for a long time after that. The light had changed from the early slant of first light to the more direct light of mid-morning, which told him more time had passed than it felt like. He looked at the body in the mud. He thought about the direction of the arm. He thought about the tonal pulse that had come 10 minutes before the gesture, about what it was for and who else might have been in the rhododendron at his back during the hour he sat facing the creek. He sat with all of it until the sitting had done what it was going to do, and then he stood up and walked back through the rhododendron and started up the skid trail toward the landing. He met Miles coming down the trail at around 8:30. He stopped him and described, in the direct and factual language he uses for everything, what he had found in the drainage. Miles listened to the full account before he said anything. Then he said he was willing to go look, and they walked back down together. The body was gone. Les went through the rhododendron first. Miles stayed at the margin of the thicket. The gravel bar was empty. The mud at the creek edge held the shaped depression of where the creature had lain, the outline of the torso, the extended right arm, the platform of the shoulder pressed into the sediment. The blood-darkened mud around the impression had spread and flattened somewhat, but was still clearly different in color and texture from the surrounding sediment. Around the impression, in the mud and in a stretch of soft ground at the upstream edge of the bar, where the drainage widened slightly before the rhododendron closed in again, there were tracks. Not one set. 4. Les crouched and examined them in the methodical way he examined evidence in the field systematically, without reaching past what the observable facts supported. 4 distinct track patterns, all of them large, all of them consistent in basic morphology. Wide heel, 4 long toes, claw impressions at the front of each. The variation in size between the 4 sets was significant. The smallest of the 4 was still larger than any wolf track Les had encountered in 30 years of working those mountains. The largest was the size of a dinner plate, pressed into the mud at a depth that indicated body weight well beyond what any recognized species in the region could produce. The tracks did not come in from the direction of the rhododendron below the gravel bar, the way Les had come in and out. They came from upstream, from the upper drainage. They came down to the impression in the mud, concentrated around it, and then returned the same way they had come back upstream, toward the cliff band, toward the wilderness boundary and whatever was beyond it. Something had come from above and taken the body back the way it came. 4 individuals, at minimum. Les spent 6 minutes photographing the scene. He photographed each track from directly above with a boot beside it for scale. He photographed the impression left in the mud. He photographed the blood-darkened sediment. He counted the images twice. Then he walked out, and Miles walked with him, and neither of them said much on the trail back up. At the landing, Miles went to his truck. Les sat on the bumper of his own and went through the photographs on his phone screen, twice. He did not reach for alternative explanations. There were none that fit the evidence. What the photographs showed was what they showed. 4 sets of tracks, a shaped depression in the mud, and the direction those tracks came from and returned to. He called the Watauga Ranger District Contracting Officer at the office in Elizabethton that morning and told him he was pulling off the sale for a few days due to a personal matter. The contracting officer was professional about it. Les told Miles to go home. He drove down the mountain to Irwin and sat at his kitchen table for a long time before he told his wife Patsy what had happened that morning. Patsy listened to all of it without interrupting. She has known Les for over 30 years. When he finished, she asked to see the photographs. She looked at each one, When she reached the last image, she set the phone on the table and asked him one question. She asked whether he thought the creature had known he was there. He told her he had been certain of that since the first moment the copper gold eye found him on the log. The territory where this happened has a history that begins long before any timber sale plan was written or any ranger district was established. The area that is now the Cherokee National Forest in Unicoi County was, before the forced removal of the Cherokee people in 1838, part of the broader Cherokee homeland, extending across the southern Appalachian highlands. The Unicoi area sits at the edge of what historians and anthropologists have documented as the Overhill Cherokee Territory, the towns and settlements of the westernmost Cherokee people, located in the river valleys of East Tennessee, and the mountain drainages between them. The Unaka Range that forms the Tennessee-North Carolina state line in this section of the Appalachians was hunting ground for the Overhill towns, and the mountains themselves carried Cherokee names before European settlers arrived in the Nolichucky and Watauga valleys in the 1770s. The name Unaka comes from the Cherokee word unaka, meaning white, a reference to the pale mist that sits on the upper slopes of the mountain in the early morning, visible from the valley floor in Limestone Cove, and from the Nolichucky River bottom east of Irwin. These mountains were known ground for the Cherokee across generations of intensive use and management before the removal displaced that knowledge along with the people who held it. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians, whose tribal lands the Qualla boundary are in Swain and Jackson counties in North Carolina, about 60 miles southeast of Onaka Mountain, maintains cultural preservation records through its Tribal Historic Preservation Office. When we contacted that office to ask about oral traditions involving large beings with canine features in the Unaka Mountain drainages, the response was careful and specific about what it would and would not address on the record. The staff member we spoke with asked that we not identify her by name. She said the Cherokee oral record includes accounts of beings in the deep mountain forest that have no correspondence in Western scientific classification, and that those accounts are maintained within the community as documentation of real encounters rather than as story or legend. She said the beings described are associated with specific places in the landscape ridgelines, cliff bands, the upper headwaters of particular drainages, and that there are traditional protocols governing how a person is expected to conduct themselves when they encounter one of these beings or find evidence of their presence. She said one more thing after a pause. She said the tradition she was familiar with included accounts of people who had encountered one of these beings in distress, and that what those accounts described, the stillness, the watchfulness, the quality of awareness that persisted even when the body was clearly failing, was consistent with what Les had observed in the drainage that morning. She said the decision to sit, to hold a respectful distance, and witness rather than interfere, was consistent with what the traditional knowledge had recommended in that situation, for as long as the accounts had been maintained. She went quiet after that. What she was preserving by going quiet was apparent. Linda Godfrey, whose 3 decades of research into upright canine encounters represents the most sustained investigation of this phenomenon from outside indigenous communities, noted across her books a pattern that emerged from hundreds of independent accounts from the Great Lakes states and the eastern woodland region. Encounters involving a dogman in a state of injury or vulnerability showed a consistent behavioral dynamic across accounts from witnesses who had no contact with each other and no shared framework for what they were describing. The being did not aggress, did not flee, and maintained an awareness of the human presence that went beyond what people expected of a large, severely injured predator in its final time. Godfrey was precise about what she could conclude from this consistency, but she noted it in multiple contexts across her documented case files, because ignoring it would have required explaining why dozens of independent witnesses were fabricating the same specific behavioral detail in accounts they had never shared publicly, and in most cases had never shared with anyone. There is one more relevant dimension to the Cherokee historical record, and what the Unaka mountain drainages represent within it. The specific stretch of the Nolichucky River Valley and the mountain slopes above Limestone Cove were involved in one of the earlier documented confrontations between Cherokee territory and European settlement, the Watauga, settlements of the 1770s, when long hunters and then permanent settlers moved into Cherokee hunting territory along the Watauga and Nolichucky River valleys before the proclamation of 1763 had been superseded, and before any formal treaty had adjusted the boundary. The Overhill Cherokee contested this settlement repeatedly, and the geography of the Unicoi Mountains, Particularly the passes and drainages that connected the river valleys to the mountain interior was contested, familiar, and actively managed in those years. The knowledge that the Cherokee held about what lived in those drainages, the beings their oral tradition described in the upper headwaters and cliff-band terrain, was held by people who had lived in active relationship with those places for generations before any European reached them. What the removal of 1838 took from that landscape was not only the people but the specific, accumulated, place-based knowledge that those people had maintained. The Forest Service eventually designated national forest land on those ridges, and the Watauga Ranger District began managing it with Western scientific frameworks that had no way to account for what the previous managers had known. The gap between those frameworks is where the patrol log entries go quiet, and the timber sale boundaries shift without documentation, and the wildlife survey recommendations are never followed up. The Cherokee National Forest patrol records for the Unaka Mountain area contain entries that fell outside standard wildlife categories and apparently never received follow-up. We reviewed several of these through a Freedom of Information Act request submitted to the Watauga Ranger District. The entries are terse in the manner of field notes written by people aware of the professional context in which they are working. A patrol log from October of 2012, 5 years before Les's incident, describes tracks found in a drainage the wilderness ranger identified as flowing toward Rock Creek. The entry noted a bipedal gait pattern, measured the stride at between 48 and 52 inches based on individual impressions in soft soil, and described the tracks as unlike any species the ranger could identify with confidence. He recommended a follow-up assessment by the district's wildlife biologist. There is no subsequent entry in any record we reviewed documenting that assessment ever occurring. The log moves directly to the next entry, a maintenance note on a backcountry bridge, as if the prior entry had been filed and absorbed into the system without producing any further action. That pattern of documentation followed by silence is not evidence of deliberate concealment. It is the structural reality of what happens when a federal land management agency encounters something that does not fit the classification system it was built to operate within. The Cherokee National Forest's wildlife management protocols are built around a recognized species list. When a field employee documents something that falls outside that list, there is no procedure for what comes next. No reporting chain, no classification form, no protocol. There is instead a very clear professional understanding of the consequences of building a case around an observation that no one in the agency hierarchy has a category for. The entry gets filed. The recommended follow-up never happens, and the patrol log moves forward, not because anyone decides to suppress the information, because the system has no mechanism for receiving it. 2 retired employees of the Watauga Ranger District spoke to Les after the incident, off the record, in the particular candor that tends to become available when professional consequences are behind you, and the cost of continuing to carry something privately has gotten high enough. The first was a former wildlife technician who had worked the district for over 2 decades before retiring. He told Les that the district had made an informal decision in the years preceding 2017 to reduce patrol frequency in the upper drainages above 4,000 feet on the Unaka mountain slopes during September and Stamplace, October. Not as a formal policy change with documentation, as a practical adjustment, made by people managing field personnel who had been coming back from those drainages with observations they could not write up without consequences, and who had eventually been reassigned to lower elevation work, rather than continue being put in a position the agency had no framework for. The upper drainages were not excluded from the patrol schedule explicitly. They were designated as adequately covered by broad annual surveys that provided geographic coverage without the specific, on-the-ground documentation that had been generating the problematic entries, and the targeted seasonal patrols that would have generated detailed field records were quietly discontinued. The second person, a former contracting officer who had administered timber sales in the district for a significant portion of her career, described something she had observed in the sale planning documents over many years of working with them. Parcel boundaries in the Unaka mountain area had shifted between planning cycles without documented justification in the environmental review record. Parcels available for harvest in one cycle were excluded in the next, with notations citing access limitations or site-specific ecological constraints that she could not locate supporting documentation for in the files. She read this as informal exclusion, practical decisions made by people who knew the upper terrain, documented only to the minimum extent required to sustain the exclusion in the planning paperwork. She acknowledged she could not prove this interpretation. It was a reading developed over many years of working with those documents. But she said the pattern of exclusions, when you map them geographically, concentrated around the upper drainages on the south face of Unaka Mountain in a way she did not believe was accidental. Les had been cutting timber in a sale whose upper boundary had been informally adjusted by people who no longer worked for the agency to exclude the drainages above him. He had not known this. The specific reasoning was nowhere in the sale documents he received. He had worked the parcels as marked and stayed within the boundary lines as specified. The discovery that others had quietly managed their institutional relationship with that mountain's upper slopes by simply not scheduling active work. There is one of the pieces of information he carries still. The creature that died on the gravel bar had come down from above the limestone cliff band. He is as certain of this as he is of anything about that morning. He examined the cliff base during one of his final boundary walks at the end of the sale, approaching along the upper edge of the parcels, to a point from which he could see the talus zone at the cliff foot, broken limestone rubble at the base of the exposed face, the sharp irregular surfaces that a large body hitting that apron from the top of the cliff would contact on the way down. The slope below the talus zone ran steeply toward the upper drainage, through a band of exposed root masses and mossy rock before the rhododendron began. The distance, the slope geometry, the surface, all of it fit a large animal coming off the cliff face and reaching the creek drainage below. He does not speculate past what fits. What he found at the upper edge of the sale area, 7 days before October 15th, was the marked tree. He was walking the upper parcel boundary a final time, checking corner markers, when he found a red oak about 30 inches at breast height, standing at the edge of the timber near the head of the drainage less than 100 yards from where the creature died. He had not noticed the claw marks on his earlier boundary walks because he had approached from a different angle. The marks ran in the bark from 4.5 feet off the ground to just over 7 feet, measured against his own height as a reference. They ran in vertical channels grouped in sets of 4, each individual channel about 3/8 of an inch wide, and cut through the bark into the cambium layer beneath. The exposed cambium inside the channels was still pale and sticky with sap. The marks were recent days old at most, not weeks. The spacing between the groups of 4 marks was approximately 3 inches, corresponding to a hand considerably wider than any black bear's front paw. The height was above what any bear in the southern Appalachians could reach from a standing position without support. He photographed the tree the same way he photographed everything else he found that fall. Multiple angles, a reference object in each frame. He added the images to the folder on his phone, alongside the gravel bar photographs and the track images. He showed them to no one until our conversations months later, when he decided that carrying all of it privately was no longer the appropriate response to what the evidence represented. That tree is a territorial marker. Whether it was placed days or years before the sale opened, he has no way to determine. What it tells him is that the drainage had been used with purpose and regularity, that whatever moved through those drainages did so within a defined territory with marked boundaries, and that the gravel bar at the creek head was inside that territory. The creature that died there had not wandered in from outside. It was on familiar ground. The cliff above the headwaters was part of the boundary of its territory, and whatever brought it to that cliff edge in the dark before October 15th remains beyond what the evidence can answer. Les did not resume cutting in the upper benches after October 15th. He moved the crew to the lower portions of the sale parcels for the remaining contract time, and left the upper benches standing. When the contracting officer noted the deviation from the approved cut plan, Les cited slope stability concerns a judgment call that falls within the faller's contractual discretion. The contracting officer accepted it. The volume left in those upper benches was substantial. Several 100,000 board feet of yellow poplar and red oak that Les walked away from without characterizing it as a sacrifice. He says it was a practical decision made with the information available to him. He was not going to take a crew of working men into a drainage where the accumulated evidence indicated an established presence of something he did not understand, on ground that the evidence now told him had not been worked precisely because people before him had understood the same thing and made the same call. What the experience cost him personally in the months that followed is harder to put in practical terms than the lost volume in the upper benches. He stopped sleeping through the night, not dramatically, not with the kind of acute disruption that shows on a person's face or in their work. He continued to show up at landings before dawn, continued to sit in the Deacon's Row on Sunday mornings, continued to be the man people in Limestone Cove, and Irwin thought they knew. But the quality of the sleep changed and has not fully recovered, and what his mind goes to in the small hours is the gravel bough and the log and the copper gold eye tracking him from the mud, and behind him the rhododendron, where something was during the hour he sat there. He does not know what was behind him, Mia. He is confident now that something was there, confident in a way he was not fully aware of during the encounter itself, because the 4 sets of tracks that came from upstream and returned upstream had to have been somewhere before Miles came back with him at 8:30, and the space in the rhododendron thicket at his back was the only cover available. Patsy noticed that he started checking the truck doors at night on the occasions when he stayed near a sale site. He had not done this before October 15th. She has not asked him directly why the habit changed, and he has not explained it. They have been married long enough that some things do not need to be named. He stopped hunting the Unaka Mountain drainages in the fall of 2017. He had hunted those draws for whitetail and turkey for close to 20 years, had learned the game trails and the deer runs and the ridges where the turkeys roosted in late October. He told his regular hunting partner that the deer sign in the Unaka area had been thin, which was not entirely untrue. The game had been displaced from those drainages all fall, for reasons that were clearer to Les now than they had been in September. His partner accepted the explanation. Les has not returned to hunt that ground since. His hunting partner asked once, in the spring after the 2017 sale, whether Les had been all right that fall. He asked it in the way that men who have known each other for 15 years ask it, not directly, not as an invitation to a particular conversation, but as a way of leaving a door open. Les told him he had been tired, that the sale had run long, that he had been burning the candle at both ends. His partner accepted this and did not press. Les recognized in the moment that this was the cost of the knowledge he was carrying, not just the knowledge itself, but the progressive necessity of concealing it from people he respected, of constructing smaller fictions to keep the larger picture from having to be explained. He does not describe this as a burden that has become unmanageable. He describes it as the texture of what life is now, the background condition against which everything else occurs. He has made a kind of peace with it, he says, the way you make peace with a chronic physical condition that is not going to resolve and is not going to end you. You adjust to it. You build your routines around it. It becomes part of the landscape of your daily life, present and acknowledged and neither dramatized nor ignored. What stays with him most, when he sits with it, is not the encounter itself. He has processed October 15th the way he processes difficult things without dramatizing it, methodically, arriving over time at a position of acknowledgement that does not require resolution. What is on that mountain is on that mountain. It was there before the Forest Service existed. It will be there after the current management cycle is finished, and the access roads close over, and the slope returns to what it was before the spur road was cut. He does not need to understand it fully to accept its presence. He has worked the Cherokee National Forest long enough to know that the management plan describes a version of the land smaller than the actual thing, and that the actual thing contains more than any plan accounts for. What stays with him is the gesture. He has turned it over hundreds of times since. The deliberate rotation of the head away from him, northwest, toward the upper watershed, the lifting of the broken arm against what must have been considerable pain, the palm opening toward the cliff and the wilderness above it, held in that orientation for 8 seconds, with the entire remaining effort of a dying body behind it. He does not believe it was involuntary, the random movement of a failing nervous system producing coincidental result. The creature had been still for the better part of an hour. The movement came with effort and direction, and came in the final minutes, when the body was past most voluntary function. Whatever produced that gesture had reason to produce it, and the direction it was aimed was not random. He has arrived at 3 ways of reading it, and he holds all 3 without settling on any one. The first, it was directed at him, a communication from one living thing to another, across whatever the distance is between them, telling him that the upper watershed was not his ground, that the cliff band marked a threshold, and the wilderness above it belonged to something that was still in it, still alive, and whose territory he was standing at the edge of. This reading fits the broader pattern of territorial behavior that researchers have documented across DOGMAN accounts and across the full DOGMAN research literature more broadly. behavior that communicates a boundary rather than enforcing it through violence, that prefers warning to contact. The wildlife displacement before October 15th, the doe running downhill, the ravens stopping at the landing's edge, all of it as earlier, less direct versions of the same message, and the gesture as the final and clearest iteration. Les finds this reading credible. The second, the gesture was not directed at him at all. The tonal pulse that preceded it by 10 minutes felt in his chest wall, organized, sustained in a way that implied directed communication rather than distress vocalization, had been aimed uphill, toward the upper drainage, toward whatever was above the cliff band, and listening. The gesture Les saw was the visible component of a transmission whose primary medium was below the range of his hearing, and the message went uphill rather than toward him. The possible meanings of that: come or don't come, stay where you are. He has sat with both possibilities and cannot eliminate either. The third, the gesture was neither instruction nor communication in any directed sense, but something more elemental, an orientation, in the final moments, toward origin. An injured animal in its last time will often turn toward the territory it came from, a biological inclination that persists past the capacity for deliberate action. The creature turned northwest, toward the wilderness above the cliff, the way something dying turns toward home, not a message, a direction, the body pointing at where it came from. Les does not prefer any of these readings to the others. He holds all three, and he says the ambiguity is appropriate given what was doing the gesturing. A man who built his career on reading observable evidence knows the difference between uncertainty that resolves with more data and uncertainty that does not. This is the second kind. What the evidence establishes without ambiguity is this: a large creature with canine morphology and bipedal locomotion died in the Rock Creek drainage on the south slope of Onaka Mountain on the morning of October 15, 2017. 4 individuals came from the upper watershed and retrieved the body, leaving tracks in the mud that exist in the photograph folder on Les's phone. A territorial marker on a red oak at the upper sale boundary indicates an established long-term presence in that drainage predating the sale. Informal adjustments in the Watauga Ranger District's patrol schedule and sale planning concentrated around the upper drainages on the south face of Onaka Mountain before 2017, in a pattern consistent with institutional accommodation of an unclassified presence, rather than with any documented operational rationale. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians' cultural preservation records contain oral history accounts describing beings in those drainages whose described behavior aligns with what Les observed on the gravel bar. A Forest Service patrol log from 2012 documents tracks in a drainage running toward Rock Creek with a bipedal gait pattern and a stride length inconsistent with any recognized species, followed by a recommended assessment that was never documented as having occurred. None of this has entered any official record as what it is. The Watauga Ranger District has no category for what Les observed. The institutional system that Les has worked alongside for 30 years is built to manage what it has already classified. What it has not classified, it cannot receive. That is architecture, not policy built by people who designed it around what they knew at the time. And what they knew at the time did not include what uses the upper drainages of Onaka Mountain. The upper sale parcels are still standing. Les drove past the spur road a year after the sale ended, and slowed to look up the access track toward where the landing had been. The road was already softening at the edges, with encroaching vegetation, alder and blackberry moving in from the shoulders, beginning the process by which an unused logging access road in the southern Appalachians is reclaimed over the course of a decade. The yellow poplar in the upper benches adds a growth ring each year and moves back through the diameter classes the sale was supposed to harvest them from. In another decade, they will have recovered most of the volume that was left when Les pulled off the upper parcels. They will go back into a planning cycle at some point. Whether the informal institutional knowledge that shaped the boundaries before 2017 still persists. By then, whether anyone working the current district knows why certain drainages in certain seasons tended to be left alone, Les does not know. He does not plan to be the one working that sale. He still works the Cherokee National Forest. He drives Forest Road 230 past the Limestone Cove turnoff on mornings when he has access to sites on the Onaka Mountain side of the district. And he drives past the spur road without stopping in the way you drive past something you understand the shape of and have made a kind of peace with. The mountain is where it is. The territory above the limestone cliff band is what it is, and what it is was there before any of the current people working the district were born, and will be there after their successors retire. He does the work on the lower slopes. In the timber, the management plan leaves accessible, and he pays attention in the way 30-odd years of fieldwork trained him to, which now includes things he was not previously trained to attend to. He checks his mirrors more than he used to on the forest roads in the early morning hours. He has not seen anything on a road that he could not account for since October 15th. The habit formed after the sale, and has not dissolved. He scans the uphill tree line and notes the quality of the stillness and drives past it. He does not interpret the consistent absence of visible activity as the territory being clear. He interprets it as the territory conducting itself the way it apparently always has in proximity to human activity on the lower slopes, staying out of view, calibrating what it reveals and what it doesn't, exercising the particular intelligence of something that has learned exactly how much visibility is too much, and has been executing that understanding successfully for longer than any ranger district has existed to document it. The gravel bar is still there. The creek still runs through the drainage, thin in October, over the same mud and rock where the shaped impression held the outline of what was there until the water seeped through and dispersed it. The red oak with the claw marks at the upper parcel boundary is still growing, widening toward the diameter class that will eventually put it back in a harvest plan, standing at the edge of the timber near the head of the drainage where the creek begins, and the slope above steepens toward the cliff and the wilderness that starts where the cliff ends. The wilderness above the cliff has no visitor trail. It receives a handful of hikers each summer who climb to the spruce fir forest near the summit and the views from Beauty Spot Bald, a mile or so northwest of the Unaka mountain peak, and descend the way they came. They do not go into the drainages below the cliff band. If they did, they would not know what to look for, and whatever is in those drainages has been calibrating its exposure relative to human activity for long enough to know exactly how to remain unknown to a person who is not specifically looking and does not know what signs to read. Les thinks about the gesture most often in the early morning, before the first saw run of the day, when the light outside the truck cab is doing the same thing it was doing on the south slope of Unaka Mountain the morning it happened, the low slant of it on the tops of the trees before it finds the ground. He sits with his coffee and the cab running for warmth, and he thinks about the pale copper-gold eye that held him on that log for close to an hour, the eye that tracked his stillness with something he has called recognition across many conversations and has not found a better word for. He thinks about the arm that lifted against everything working against it in those final minutes and opened its hand northwest, toward the upper creek, toward the cliff, toward whatever was above the wilderness boundary, and listening. He does not know what the gesture was trying to say. He knows the direction it was aimed. He knows what it cost to aim it. He knows that it was deliberate, that it came from a creature that had spent an hour on a creek bank in its final time with something present that was not its own kind, and that chose to use its last deliberate movement in a specific direction rather than in no direction at all. He sits with that. It sits more quietly than it used to. He has one habit that formed in the years after October 2017, and that he has mentioned across several conversations as something he considers worth noting. On mornings when he works the higher elevation sales in the Cherokee National Forest, the sales that take him above 3,000 feet, into the terrain where the understory closes in, and the drainages begin their climb, toward the higher ridges, he sits in his truck for a few minutes after he parks, before he starts up whatever trail or road leads to the day's work. He sits and listens to the quality of the silence around the truck. He has no conscious protocol for this. He does not know exactly what he is listening for. He says it is not fear, and it is not superstition, and it is not the specific kind of alertness that follows trauma, which he has read enough about to understand the difference. He says it is respect, a few minutes of sitting still and paying attention before he begins, in the way that a person shows respect for a place they understand they share rather than own. He is not certain the sitting changes anything. He does no believe it does. But it is what the experience left him, and he does it anyway. The mountain is still up there. The wilderness above the cliff band is still what it is, holding what it holds, unchanged by the fact that one timber faller from Limestone Cove knows more about what is in it than any official record reflects. Les goes to church on Sunday mornings and drives the same roads and does the work below the informal boundaries, and the Unaka Mountain wilderness is on the ridge above the town the way it has always been, the way it was before the Forest Service designation, and the way it will be after. What belongs to it stays with it. That seems to be how it has always worked up there, and Les has found, across several years of sitting with it, that the arrangement is not one he needs to change.